So this is a really cool question, because I don't think we talk a lot about latency, both in audio or in plugin latency. And excuse me. Latency basically is just something that happens due to the delays in interface communication. So what happens when we are talking about maybe audio latency, or the latency between the interfaces, audio interfaces? And then I will talk about plugin latency. And what is latency is the time, for instance. Let me explain you my setup here. I have my keyboard here, my Arturia Keylab 61. Then I have this connected through SP to my computer. And then I have FL Studio recognizing the Keylab 61 as a plug-and-play MIDI device. Whenever I click on a note in my keyboard, it takes it takes time from that note to be processed in the Arturia Keylab 61, in the CPU of this MIDI device. Then has to go through the MIDI cable or the USB cable as MIDI, then has to come into the computer, be processed by the motherboard and the CPU. Then the operating system has to send that information directly into FL Studio. So all of this takes time. And this time from the moment that I click on the note and the note is activated, and the time that I see the note being activated in FL Studio, this time is called the latency. And it happens in pretty much all software, in pretty much all devices. There will always be latency, and you cannot avoid it. What you can do is work around it, and latency is below 12 or 20, maybe 20 milliseconds. I think it's 12 to 20 milliseconds. It's not perceptible to the human ear. And if you have latencies higher than that, then you will have a difference, or you will recognize some artifacts or some delay whenever you click on a note and then you hear it on the FL Studio. And then you also have to introduce the latency of, so let's say I click a note in my keyboard, then the information travels into the computer, goes into FL Studio, then FL Studio has processed this, has to generate a sound through my virtual instruments, then has to process that sound, go through the effects, then send that sound or that information through the operating system to the motherboard, and then into my headphones or speakers. All of this takes time. And if that time is less than 12 milliseconds or 20, you will not have a difference. You will not perceive a difference. If that difference is higher, then it will be very hard for you to play, because the latency is too high, and you will notice a difference whenever you click and whenever you hear, and that will affect your musicality. So this is for instance, the interfaces latencies. The same happens with my audio interface, because my audio interface is connected through USB, and most of audio interfaces are connected through USB. And you can always tweak the audio configurations to either lower the latency. When you are recording, you want very low latency. When you are mixing or doing very processing intensive projects, you might want to increase the latency, because it doesn't matter. For instance, if you are mixing, you just hit play and it might take like 500 milliseconds, and it will be okay, because all the sound will play at the same time, and you are not interfacing with FL Studio through a MIDI keyboard or a microphone or something like that. So that's okay. So when you want to just mix a project, you might increase the latency if you have issues with dropouts. But if you don't, if you want to record, you might reduce the latency so that you can, whenever you talk, it automatically goes in, not automatically, but you have a very short latency, and you will not have too much problems with time alignments when you are recording audio. So that's audio / interfaces / devices latency. Then you have plugin latency. So what is plugin latency? what we have in digital systems, like DAWs, Digital Audio Workstation, what we have is we have some a thread or a process that processes audio. And then we have our instruments. And what happens is that, let's say that I have an EQ, a compressor, and then a reverb. What happens is that the data will be sent, or the audio data will be sent to those plugins to be processed, and to the plugins to process the effect, and then spit out a piece of data, new data, with the effects on it. And some plugins just take the data that you send them and right away process it and give it away. So other plugins have to wait for more data to process. So let's say that we have a compressor with look ahead. What happens is that because the plugin is applying some look ahead, so is looking in the future what's going to happen so that it can apply a different type of compression, what happens is that the plugin has to delay the processing of the data. So what happens is that you send, or the FL Studio sends a package of data into the plugins, and then the plugin has to wait a little bit longer, maybe for 2 or 3 packages of data, and then it can process those packages of data, processes them, and then starts spitting out after maybe the 4th package of data. So this also increases the latency, the plugin latency. And it's a different type of latency, but the concept is the same. It's just a delay in the communication or in the processing of the data that happens with plugins. And some plugins have very short latencies, like 1 sample of latency. Some plugins have like 20 milliseconds of latency. One plugin that has a lot of latency that I can remember of is one that I use in my mastering chain is Isotope Elements. Another one is from Waves, which is the linear multiband compressor. That one also uses a lot of latency. So it all, luckily FL Studio does a very good job internally with processing the different types of latencies in the plugins so that you don't hear any artifacts. So what would happen is that, let's say that you have 2 different channels playing. Let's say in one you are playing a drums, and in the other one you are playing a bass. Let's say that in the drums you apply an EQ and compressor, and in the bass you don't do anything. What happens is that if the drums, the plugins that you have in the drums, if they apply like 10 milliseconds each of latency, you will have 20 milliseconds of latency in the drums. And from the time you hit play, you will have the bass playing, and only after 20 milliseconds you will start hearing the drums. And this can create some misalignment of your timings in your productions. What happens internally is that FL Studio detects that latency, the sum of the entire latency of the channels, and then adjusts everything. So in this case, you would hit play, the data would be processed or sent to the compressor, EQ and compressor in the drum channel, and then the bass channel will wait also 20 milliseconds to start sending audio. And this way you will only have all the channels aligned with the same time latency, so that you don't have misalignments and phasing issues with your channels. Yeah, I know it's a little bit complex concept, but it's very important to understand because we are working in digital systems, and the better you understand latency, the better you will have, or the better understanding you have from DAWs, the better you will be able to use them and manipulate them in your own projects, and understanding more about these. The tool that we use to make music is essential to make better music.